All right, let's move on to the second of our big stories. You ready?
Yep.
Y'all might have heard about something called the No Kings protest, which I find hilarious. That was basically creating a problem that didn't exist, never will exist, and it was a reason for, Democrat activists to show up and rally against whatever, something. Um, there's not a single person in this chat or watching the show that wants Donald Trump to be a king. He has no intention of being that. It's a made-up problem. I personally think it's one of those typical things that the think tanks in D.C. got together and said, "Oh, okay, we're just getting our asses kicked in the polls. We got to do something to change the narrative and rally the troops." So they did a focus group poll and they settled on no kings, and that'll help us portray our message that Trump's a dictator. It was a massive, colossal fail. A lot of us were expecting big violence, but it didn't happen. What I think is interesting is the where the funding came from. So I'm going to share real quick. How ridiculous this was. Is Well, I saw it firsthand. Where I live in New Hampshire, there was an event in a park, literally 3 blocks that direction, and my office window is right here and overlooks it, and I can watch the people walking towards it. Mostly, basically, it was a senior citizen getaway day, and a few families with signs. Yeah, I got a cute picture of some neighbors that had like 8 of their friends um, show up with homemade signs, but most of these signs were put together by groups like Churla, which we've discussed ad nauseum. We'll get into the funding here in a second, but bottom line is absolutely nothing was done with that, and nothing happened. It was the biggest non-event in history. Didn't change anyone's mind, and I don't, I think it was an absolute failure. But we do need to talk about it because it was a big event. And I wanted to share real quick a something I put up on Twitter, which I'm gonna pat myself on the back, thought was hilarious. I said, I need some help coming up with a problem that doesn't exist and never will exist so that I can get NGOs and the mainstream media to spend millions in marketing to give all the retirement homes in the country an event to go to, which is basically what this was. Any ideas? And I said, how about no vampires? We could make up signs, march, and annoy all the normal people trying to go through their lives. Thoughts? I got some really funny responses that someone said, how about no zombies? I go, no, 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 wait a minute. Zombies do exist. It doesn't fit the criteria because we see zombies running around every single day. Um, we get, there's a bunch of other crazy ones. Someone said, how about no banks on Pluto? Okay, that fits the criteria. It's never going to be a problem. It isn't a problem, and it's never going to be a problem. We should go march for that. That's a good cause. It makes as much sense as no kings. It's one of the dumbest talking points I think the left has ever come up with, and they should be embarrassed right now because it's a complete non-event. That being said, the funding is fascinating. And so in our research corner of the internet, there's a lot of brilliant minds that have learned, how to find data because a lot of this stuff is publicly available. And when we start putting our collective heads together, this is the reason the good guys are winning the information war. And there's one person in particular who's just drilled this one home. There's a woman named Data Republican, and she went on the Steven Crowder show for about 7 or 8 minutes yesterday. And I want to play the clip. I'll let her speak for herself, or I'll let her interpreter speak for her. This is really fascinating to watch. I think she's one of the best researchers we have, and just an amazing analyst. My whole shtick for the last 20 plus years is follow the money, and she does it as well as anybody I've ever seen. Absolute shout out to Data Republican because she's a rock star, and I'm going to play that right now so you can catch your breath because this is worth listening to follow the money of how the dark money sets up these things through NGOs, and you're going to learn something about something called um, donor advised funds, DAFs. And she's going to talk about it a little bit more, and then I'm going to fill you in with some detail because in my career as a investment advisor, I've encountered these quite a bit. So this is something you're not going to hear anywhere else. Well, you can hear her on Crowder, but what I follow up with,
You know what you
Crowder,
meant, Brady.
Crowder is now the biggest show, I guess the biggest live stream on in the world. All right. Shoot, I gotta stop that. I forgot to hit share volume. So give me a second. I forgot we were on Zoom.
So many different platforms.
Yeah, I know. Give me 1 second. Clicking buttons all over the place. How do I share sound? There we go. Okay, I'm gonna hit play. Tell me, just thumbs up if you can hear it.
Comes from. There's been a lot of conjecture online, but we thought, hey, let's go to the single foremost expert on this subject to lead off the show. Let's bring on Data Republican.
Hi.
Hi.
So
And for
you
people,
guys.
nice to be with you. And for people who don't know, Data Republican, this is Data and Republican's interpreter, Terrell. Thank you for being with us. We very much
Thank
appreciate.
you. I am the data interpreter. All of us both.
So are you, I mean, obviously you're sign fluent, but are you data fluent as well, Terrell? Sorry, this is for you, but you could go both ways.
Yeah, I can understand the data after the data Republican explains it to me.
Yes. It's like,
She is the top.
right.
She's the top expert, like you said. I just have her back. So
Yes.
I'm ready.
And people can go to datarepublican.com. You can follow Data Republican at Data Republican on X. And I do have some questions for you, Miss Data, if I may. You have this interactive database on your website, meticulously lays out the funding behind these protests. And we do have a chart that we want to show the audience, because I'm sure, as you know, data can get overwhelming. Can you first explain this database, what you found, and how you used AI to help track the money flow?
Oh, yes, of course. I would love to. Oh, yes, yes. So I downloaded all of the 990 forms and I was able to connect them together.
Right.
What I did was kind of like integrated all of the grants together, the charities, and the AI helps a lot with that. For example, organizations like the Soros Foundation,
Yes.
they have filed something called a 990 EF. And what that does is that they report nonprofits that they give grants to, but they don't report the EIN identification number. So it makes it really hard to connect them, but AI is able to make those matches.
Right. This is
We'll
the
have to double check
sure.
because AI.
Yes. Plus, AI can overtake us all. And I know that you've described Data Republican, these DAFs, donor advised funds, as sort of a black box of the nonprofit world. I'd like you to explain it a little better, but I want to show a chart, and I believe Toolman can send this to you because, this issue can be pretty complicated. So we took an example for the ACLU, and please tell us if we have this correct. This is an example of taxpayer dollars, right? That goes to the Tides Foundation. Yes, Tide Center, then the ACLU, and to Indivisible, which is No Kings. So I don't know if you can both see this, but this is kind of how we created this chart. And if you could help explain to people the DAF, because it is tough to fully track by design.
Yes. So what you need to understand this.
Just so you know, that chart's a little bit simplistic. I'm not going to give you a more complex one, or I may I'll give you some links where you can find one, but that was simplistic. But continue.
Is that most of this is very dark. And these politicians get all of their money from these DAFs, these donor advised funds. A DAF is not required to be transparent to who's actually giving the money. So it's like, for example, if like a lot of our tax money goes to organizations and then that organization will give that money to some kind of DAF. And we have no idea who directs that money within the DAF or what they use that money for. And you're absolutely right. It's absolutely a black box. Like if Bill Gates gives a donor DAF $1 million, he can say, oh, give that to whoever, left-wing activists, whatever. And then the DAF will make that donation on his behalf. But the money somehow ends up in the wrong place with like a violent group or something like that. It's really easy to deny.
Right. And some of the most notable examples of organizations, and I'd love to hear which ones you think stand out the most, because we don't know how much, to be clear, how many tax dollars go to Indivisible. But the ACLU, the teachers union, for example, there's a lot of influence from crypto. Which ones stood out the most to you?
The major group?
Yes, the major groups that stood out the most.
Indivisible, yes, that's one of them. The other one, and they're all Soros groups.
Yes.
These are all Soros groups. I just want to be very clear. The AFL-CIO, Weingarten. And there's also a Swiss businessman, a billionaire, called Hans-Jörg Wyss. Soros and Hans-Jörg Wyss, they finance all of these protests. But I see the AFL-CIO supports that as well.
Right. Yeah, that is one thing too. These unions, by the way, that of course this goes through a DAF. They receive.
Colonel, real quick, explain why unions want to fund left-wing protests and NGOs, because you did a great job of that last week.
So in 1983, they set up National Endowment for Democracy. They set up 4 buckets of money: Republican, Democrat, Union, and the Chamber of Commerce. So in every country around the world that U.S. oligarchs or Western oligarchs want to go do business, the people indigenous to that country don't want to be exploited naturally. So they will, if you have, like in Chile, a copper mine, Anaconda Copper, and they're paying the workers 86 cents a day to work in hellacious conditions, and those people under a democracy know that America has unions, they're going to unionize. But they're not going to unionize and be controlled by Anaconda. And so what National Endowment for Democracy did was funnel money to this union activist entity under it's our money. And though they actually have a school they send them to in Washington, D.C., they deploy terrorists to go down and infiltrate unions in order to then label them communist, so that the CIA can then go in and take out those unions that are legitimate unions, they are not communist, and free up labor resources for Anaconda to keep exploiting. And this is done all over the world. That's why Nestle uses child labor in Africa. That's why the United Fruit was able to buy up all of the farmland in Latin America and exploit the workers down there, because every single time they try to unionize, the unions are infiltrated. And then, of course, when I found all of this out, I'm like, well, are our unions not real either? And no, our unions are not real either. Every single union, if you go back to the antitrust, breaking up the monopolies, all they did was a different approach. Instead of actually having a monopoly and exploiting everybody outright, they go, oh yeah, let's break Standard Oil up into 5 different entities and pretend like they're not related, but they all still are. And then we're going to set up this trade association of oil producers. And we're also going to create the oil union of oil workers, and we're going to own both of them. So they still own it. It just looks like 3 separate entities. So there are no such thing as real unions.
Yeah, and a real fun thing about what we just said about breaking up Standard Oil. Do you want to know who owned Marathon Oil? Yeah, that would have been Rockefeller. Standard Oil bought them 2 years after their inception. The same Marathon Oil we talked about in our last story.
Earlier. Yes.
Real important point is the National Endowment for Democracy was created under Reagan.
Yes.
The reason this happened was because in '75, the Church Committee, Congress actually did its job for one of the very few times in our lifetime, and they investigated the shenanigans of the CIA, and the CIA got curtailed quite a bit. Carter comes in, we have the Halloween, it's called the Halloween Massacre, where we fired 1/3 of the CIA, and a lot of their covert operations were totally curtailed. So they turned around, created the National Endowment for Democracy, and they started doing the exact same stuff with regime change, interfering with local politics, so our multinational corporations can exploit the resources of other countries, and that's what it's always been all about, is exploiting the resources. They did that, and they could do it publicly under the guise of these NGOs who are pretending to do charitable work. And that's what the National Endowment of Democracy is. All right, continuing with the wonderful Data Republican.
Receive taxpayer dollars, and then it goes through several steps and goes to Indivisible, who, can you have them send me the total number, Indivisible, what they have in their coffers?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not for you. That's for my researchers. Also, a CC.
The AFL-CIO takes $62 million. Yes, they take $62 million. And that is why that's why they are our quote unquote soft power organization called Solidarity Center.
Yes.
The AFL-CIO takes their money, and what do they do with it? They give it to protests and color revolutions all over the world.
Yes, well, I was actually punched in the face live on television in Michigan by an AFL-CIO SEIU member. So that was fun.
$12.8 million.
Mike Benz actually predicted this. Mike Benz was the one who threw it down. He said that the AFL-CIO would be leading these violent protests right here. And he was right.
Yes.
There's a guy called Randy Weingarten, and he also happens to be on the board of the NDI.
Yes.
Right, which is which is with all that embroiled with the NED, and that's the Democrats' soft power organization of the world.
Yes. No, absolutely. We have some clips from Randy Weingarten later, and this is what's so corrupt. This is the teachers union advocate. Indivisible has about $12 million.
12.8 in gross receipts is what it looks like.
It's Soros, AFL-CIO, and this guy, this millionaire beast that have supported and funded these color revolutions.
Now,
okay, so everybody gets the big picture at this point, right?
But no, they missed the entire big picture. They're looking at the front engine of the CIA. All of this is a front for the CIA, and no one ever talks about it.
Well, we do.
Yeah.
That's pretty much most of what we talk about. So let me give you a little bit more on Data Republican real quick. Just I'd like to share the resources to get this spread, because she's very much worth sharing. Right here we've got, she's created a number of databases. This one is just for the No Kings from datarepublican.com. It's got all kinds of resources. You can find this stuff yourself. We also have one she's done for federal grant search. You enter a keyword, you can find out who's gotten a federal grant. And a lot of this information is taken from usaspending.gov. One of the biggest organizers of the LA riots was, we've all heard of CHIRLA, CHIRLA, which is a coalition for human rights in Los Angeles. And they've received about millions of dollars from other sources, but just from U.S. government grants. If you go down here, the biggest one is the Department of Homeland Security. Why is the Department of Homeland Security funding an organization that is financing riots and protests against the U.S. government? The Department of Homeland Security aren't they working? It's a complete conflict of interest. It's the greatest example of how embedded the quote unquote deep state is in everything. You also have the Small Business Association, was funding CHIRLA and the riots. Why is a small business association? If you go look to their websites, the DHS and the SBA, look what their mandates are, and they say nothing about financing pro-illegal immigration organizations. It's absolutely ridiculous. That's where your tax dollars are going. It's a big problem. But this website,
I'm sure that's just money that's going to the printer for all of their crazy sites. You know what I mean? That's how they get around this.
Well, it's a giant circle jerk. What I'm describing here is a circle jerk. And your tax dollars go in, it goes out to one of these agencies, or these NGOs and stuff like that. And the NGOs spend it on stuff that goes against your wishes, the things that we want. And some of that money also goes back to the campaign coffers of the politicians who give grants to the same NGOs. It is absolutely the most corrupt system you've ever seen. And that's how a very large part of our government is run. But I'm going to take it a step further here. So she talks about donor advised funds. Now, what these are, it's basically a charitable donation. I've used these because they have legitimate purposes. I've used these for my high net worth clients. If you, for example, start a company and your company stock, you've killed it. You've made $100 million. Your cost basis is pretty much zero. When you sell that stock, it gets taxed as long-term capital gains. Okay, that gets favorable treatment, better than income. So the richest people in the world have already rigged the system. So when they make money, they pay less in taxes than you and I do with our regular income tax. So you're going to see a lot of tax rigging come up here. But if they don't want to pay the tax at all, they can just give it away to charity because we've created tax laws by bribing politicians to create these tax laws. This is why we have lobbyists. They go to Congress. You send your people to Congress, say, look, this would be a really neat tax law to make an unequal tax field. One strategy that's used quite often, and I've employed it for clients, because as a fiduciary, I've got to take care of my clients, to take advantage of the existing tax laws, is I could just give the 100 million, just give it away to charity, and you don't pay any taxes. Well, yeah, but that wipes out all the money. Well, here's where it gets neat. You don't give it, you create a charitable remainder trust. It's called a CRT. So you put this $100 million in a charitable remainder trust. Well, the charitable remainder trust has some charity that's got to pay some money eventually down the road. But in the meantime, it's got to invest the money. So let's say it just puts the money into tax-free municipal bonds. Long-term rate of return, we'll call it 5%. Municipal bonds are 100% tax-free. So I put $100 million and I put it into a charitable remainder trust that invests in tax-free municipal bonds, creates 5% a year. That's $5 million a year in tax-free income. And who is the in charge of this charitable remainder trust? Who's the trustee? Oh, it's me. So I've avoided taxes for my entire generation. I got $5 million a year going in, getting paid to me from dividends, interest from my municipal bonds, and I never paid taxes again. But I just took the money. What about my heirs? I just gave away $100 million. Eventually, it's got to go to charity. Well, that's easily solvable. For about $500,000 a year, I can buy, if I'm young enough and healthy enough, I can buy $100 million life insurance policy that when I die, $100 million goes to my heirs tax free because we've lobbied Congress and said life insurance benefits are not taxable. So we've completely bypassed the entire tax system. Sounds pretty good, right? It works. This is what's done with the high net worth people all the time. Now, the Colonel and I have talked about foundations. The first two tax-free foundations, keywords, tax-free foundations ever created were the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, two of the wealthiest families in the history of mankind. Robber barons, created by the single party rule of the Republican Party. Totally different conversation. I'm not going to go off the track. This was done in 1910-ish when they were created by the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell was involved in that. Sullivan and Cromwell, of course, were the ones that helped the Treaty of Versailles, Spanish-American War. That's where the Dulles brothers came out of, the Sullivan and Cromwell, who created the CIA. Not exactly our favorite people. 2 years while they were creating these tax-free foundations, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers are sending their minions, their bankers, to Jekyll Island to create the semblance of not only the Federal Reserve, but as part of that legislation, the three-pronged legislative effort of 1913 also created the income tax. So the rest of us started paying income taxes while they are now hiding their generational wealth behind a tax-free foundation so they can basically never pay taxes again. And they have to kick their money out of the foundation periodically. There are some rules, and we'll go into that. And they use those money to lobby our politicians to continue to give them, basically favorable laws in DC, and also basically to run our foreign policy, which benefits them and their cronies and our multinational corporations so that we do things like regime change all over the world. This is how the system works. But these donor advised funds are the next level. And I'm going to tell you right now, donor advised funds are legitimate in many ways. A lot of them are legit, but they can be misused because of the lack of transparency. So right here, this is one of the second biggest donor advised fund in the world is NP Trust. And they have a nice breakdown. If you want to set up a private foundation, it could take several weeks or months. You do a donor advised fund, you just go to Fidelity and say it can happen immediately. Are there startup costs? None with a donor advised fund. The private foundation, you have legal and other fees are typically substantial, tens and hundreds of thousands. Ongoing administration and management fees, about 85 basis points plus investment management fees, which at that level is probably around 0.5%. For a foundation, it's 250 to 400 basis points because you're paying lawyers and accountants. Donor advised fund does it all for you. Tax deduction. These guys get a tax deduction on this stuff. So not only do they not pay taxes when the money grows inside, but they get a deduction when they donate it. For a donor advised fund, it's 60% of adjusted gross income. And for foundations, only 30%. These donor advised funds are even more advantageous than a family tax-free foundation. That's a powerful statement right there.
That's huge.
Yeah. The tax deduction limits for gifts of stock or real property, 30% of your adjusted gross income versus 20% of adjusted gross income. Donor advised fund, again, got better rules. The valuation of gifts is at fair market value. If I gift my 100 million of appreciated stock, it gets valued at the market value. It's different with foundations. It's fair market value for publicly traded stock, cost basis for all other gifts, including gifts of closely held stock or real property. Another disadvantage for the private foundation. Required grant distribution, none for the donor advised funds. And as I said earlier, the tax-free foundation must distribute 5% of net asset value annually, but it's tax-free if it's invested in bonds, in municipal bonds. Excise tax on investment income, none. Excise tax for a private foundation is 1.39%. Is there anybody in this chat that pays more than 1.39% on their income? Probably all of you.
Everybody.
One of the biggest things being debated right now in the bigger, better, Trump's big, beautiful bill is they're actually talking about doubling this excise tax on foundations to 2.8%. And they're fighting it tooth and nails, that extra 1.4%. They are fighting this. Privacy. Names of individual donors are not disclosed to the public and grants can be made anonymously. You have no idea who's putting the money into these donor advised funds. With a foundation, you must file informational returns which are available to the general public, disclosing detailed information on grants, investment fees, trustee names, staff salaries, etc. And the administrative responsibilities are recommended grants to favorite charitable causes. We'll get back to that in a second. Over here, the administrative responsibilities for a foundation is to manage assets, keep records, select charities, administer grants, file state and federal tax returns, and maintain board minutes, etc. So you can see why a high net worth people are starting to go to these donor advised funds. It's all great. It's all part of estate planning, right? Because if you're ultra wealthy, you get advantages the rest of us do not. It is ridiculous that this is allowed to exist the way it is. I'm a big fan of people building up wealth and passing it on to the next generation. What I'm not a fan of is getting those, passing on that wealth with tax advantages that nobody else gets to see. The estate tax is a problem, breaks up family farms, etc. But there's a happy medium between making it fair and totally advantaging the mega rich. And the reason this exists is because we know who writes the rules. That is what Data Republican was hinting at. She did not, obviously didn't have my career experience on some of this stuff, and I'm hoping she gets to watch this and understands this stuff because she can go deeper into it because she's absolutely a brilliant autist. But that's what's going on. Who's funding the LA riots? these donor advised funds, a lot of them, let's pull one up real quick. Let's see if I have one handy. And I think I
Oh,
do.
while you're doing that, I just want to mention that when it talks about the history of where I was trying to find out when that was passed in law to create those things, because it's always important to know who controlled Congress at the time. But it says the first one was the New York Community Trust pioneered donor advised funds in 1931. And there was a second one that was set up in 1935. Well, if you look at the New York Community Trust, do you know who the first person that what the trust first grant was awarded in 1924 when Roosevelt Schiff gave $1,000 to establish a memorial fund,
Would that be someone who's related to Jacob Schiff?
as in SCHIFF?
Yep.
Yeah,
Not a big shocker at all. So
I knew you'd appreciate that.
So if you want to know why we all get to struggle, and every April 15th to pay our taxes and other people don't, they get to accumulate wealth, ad nauseam, wealth and power and influence. This is exactly why. These are the vehicles they use. And like I said, let's take a look at, because this is, like I said, this is the biggest donor advised fund in the world is Fidelity. This is the second biggest. And just look, and here's how they get away with it. Everything's done under the guise of charity. If you start looking at some of their grants in action, um, going on a field trip of a life, blah, blah, blah. Support for domestic violence survivors. Sounds like a good cause, right? Making a wish list for children in under-resourced communities with Operation Warm. The senior source providing agency and showing support to aging individuals. The World Bird Sanctuary rescue and conservation efforts. Go ahead, talk about the World Wildlife Fund, because I know you're going to.
Well, most of these things are garbage. They have a Bernays level style propagandist that makes these websites and make you feel all warm and fuzzy. But the World Wildlife, when you talk about sanctuary and animal and all that other stuff, there's no bigger quote unquote advocate of that than World Wildlife Fund. And when you get into World Wildlife Fund, at the end of the day, it is a front used by Western oligarchs in oil to exploit. In primarily, it was focused at Africa, but it did go to Indonesia and several other places, and set up, like, take indigenous people's forest land and convert them over to palm oil plantations so that they could have a bunch of slaves working for them. And that's what, and they then get the little panda seal of approval that they're green. The entire thing was a scam. And at the back end of all of these plantations and these set-asides for, like, the Serengeti, they were putting in terrorist training camps under the auspices of a national park to conserve resources. So the entire thing's a scam.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And again, there's some legitimate charitable, and they always hide it behind the guise of charity because that's how they get away with it. Politicians feel good because, oh, I created a loophole for charitable giving, and everyone feels good about that. But I'll remind you that John Rockefeller was considered one of the dirtiest scoundrels that ever lived, one of the most cutthroat businessmen of all time, and he had to hire a PR person who said, "Hey, why don't you start giving money to charity?" And he's got the John David Rockefeller. He's got these awful pictures of this vampire-looking guy because J.D. Rockefeller, when he got older, looked scary, handing out pennies or nickels or quarters to children on the street, and that was their whole idea of trying to uh, fix his image, and they've been going with it ever since. This is the mechanism they've been using for more than a century to control our government. But if it was just for good charities, this would still be a problem because of the tax advantages to the rich. It's worse because now they're giving it to charities that are doing things like drumming up street violence, Democrat causes, color revolutions around the world. This is George Soros's Open Societies Foundation was founded as a tax loophole like this in South Africa for his son. And then it evolved when Soros started working with the CIA and the State Department and started funding these regime change operations around the world. And that's how Soros made his money. He's working with the CIA and the State Department. He's speculating on foreign currencies, basically shorting them, and he knows which countries are about to get toppled. It's insider trading. So he's getting, he's getting from both ends of, that's exactly how Soros made his money. This is how the world really works. That's the point I wanted to hammer home tonight. So if you want to follow up on that, or you want to move on to the next topic?
No, I think you did a great job. I do think that people who stop at Soros is selling the entire infrastructure that has been set up to do this strategy of tension short. He is simply a money changer. Everybody likes to think that he's like the Jabba the Hutt guy sitting at the top of the pyramid. He is not. He is a worker bee in the strategy of tension, and I would say that he functions like the Nugent Hand Bank and BCCI Bank of the yesteryears that were the money launderers for the CIA and the drug trafficking and all that other stuff. Soros is another source of revenue. When he shorts currency and generates profit, it is plowed back into this Operation Gladio destabilization target hit list of anybody who goes against the oligarch hierarchy of where they're going to get their resources from. So, yeah.
Very good.